Hey everyone, just wanted to give you a quick heads up. The second Global Product Owner Summit is coming soon. You can get all the details at bit.ly/Product Owner 2024. That's bit.ly/Product Owner 2024. And it's all lowercase, all one word. Oh, and stick with us until the end of the episode to know the dates and the tracks that we have for you in this year's summit. But for now, let's dive into today's episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special bonus episode. We have with us for today's special bonus episode two representatives of the Kanban University. More on that in a bit. But first, let me welcome Todd Little and Joey Spooner. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Vasco.
Yeah, thanks, Vasco.
So I'll start with Todd. Todd is the chairman of the Kanban University, is also an experienced executive in developing commercial technology, specializing in building sustainable organizations for rapid business challenges, and also a pioneer in lean and agile methods, author and global speaker, leading also large teams. I met Todd many years ago. We also talked a lot about no estimate, so I'm curious about what we're going to talk about next. And our second guest is Joey Spooner. He's the Vice President of Product Management at the Kanban University. Joey is a versatile leader with 22 years of experience across sectors like communications, insurance, and other technology sectors, specializing in product and project management. He holds a bachelor's from the University of Florida. Beautiful state. I've been there many times. I'm so allergic, though. It's so hard to be there. And focusing on innovative community development. We're going to talk about a topic that I think some might find controversial, and that's okay because we're here to think and to develop thinking further. And controversy usually asks us to consider our long-held beliefs, and we love to do that here on the podcast. So we're going to talk about Scrum Better with Kanban. So let's start from the beginning, Todd. First, share a little bit about your journey into the world of Agile, and how did you come to advocate blending Scrum with Kanban in your work?
Well, thanks, Vasco. So I've been around for a while. I've been working in product development for over 40 years, and my background is in engineering, and so we were developing products, software products for engineers and scientists. Some really cool stuff, high-performance computing, 3D visualization. The thing is, almost everything we were doing was brand new. It was all new. And so it had a high degree of uncertainty. And so back in the 1990s, as I was starting to take on management roles, I was having to figure out, how do I plan with uncertainty? And nothing I was seeing at the time was making any sense. It just didn't. All these plans were all plan up front and just escalate, just do it and it'll all work out. And it never did. And it wasn't working out for anyone else, but no one was admitting it. And then I finally met Jim Highsmith, who was talking about complexity theory. And so I said, this is someone who actually is talking in the space that actually makes sense with how I work. And so we were at the same time, we were organizing worldwide developer conferences internally at our company. And so we were bringing in speakers like Jim Highsmith. We brought in Kent Beck, who had just written about extreme programming, Alistair Coburn, also Tim Lister and Tom DeMarco from Peopleware. So we were getting the opportunity to meet up and get some cool ideas on how to do software better. And then in 2002, I ended up going to the Cutter Conference, which was where I met Alistair Coburn. And he talked about how he was going to start an Agile conference. And I told him about types of things we were doing at our conference. And so we hit it off really well, and that's when we started the Agile Development Conference in 2003 in Salt Lake City. And so we worked that together. It was a great partnership. Alistair went on. I ended up taking on the Agile 2004 conference. And then in 2005, we merged with the XP Agile Universe conference, which had been actually the first conference, and decided let's merge the communities and pull it together. So that was an interest. I took on that merger. And then continued to be involved in the conference space for a while. Meanwhile, in 2004, at one of the conferences at the Agile at the ADC 2004, Jim Highsmith organized a group of people looking at leadership and project leadership in particular. And that group ended up creating the Agile Project Leadership Network, which is now known as just the Agile Leadership Network. Still has a few active chapters, not a lot. But it's where I also met David Anderson. David Anderson was involved in that group, and he had hosted the group at Microsoft campus in Redmond in 2005. And that's where we wrote the Declaration of Interdependence for project leadership. And it created a very good friendship with David, and we started, collaborating over what he was doing and what we were doing, and doing all of that. Meanwhile, I was doing my day job as an executive, running a group, and so kept doing that for a while. And so I was just trying to apply these things, and so knowing what David was doing, I was loving what was going on with Kanban. I was also very active in doing things within Scrum and seeing how they work together. Seeing where they're appropriate, and seeing how ideas from each were blending together very nicely. Eventually, I decided to join Kanban University in 2017, and have been working through there. And I think eventually I came to the realization that we had things to offer the Scrum community, but we weren't really packaging it in a way that it was accessible to the Scrum community, even though we knew it. When a fundamental premise of the principle of the Kanban method is to start with what you do now. If you're already doing Scrum, then we should be honoring that and working through an evolutionary change approach to improve that Scrum. And I think finally, after a few years of beating our heads up, we thought this is really what we need to be doing. We need to be joining these together because we've seen it in the real world. It's just we've many case studies showing the benefits that we get from combining these and working to make the Scrum better. And so that's where we're at, and the journey continues.
Now, of course, there's a lot of phrases that I want to unpick there, but Joey should also get the chance to introduce his own journey and how you, Joey, how did you come to advocate blending Scrum with Kanban in your work?
It was actually from the field, Vasco. So somewhat like Todd, I'm not as far along as Todd is in his career, which is, it's great to work with someone this senior to work with in sort of this space, which has been a lot of fun, honestly. But I started around, I would say, 05, 06, researching sort of better, more efficient ways of working in places where costs were really tight, where it was really meant to be super efficient, super low cost to develop new things. And that's when I kind of stumbled across some publications from David Anderson on the economics of software development primarily, which he based on other people's work, which is amazing. It's really good creative thinking. And so that led me to kind of follow him. And along the way, I picked up the Kanban stuff that he was writing about as well. And around 2013, 2014, I picked up a contract job with the Department of Labor here in the US. And they had a decent sized team building some software applications for the department. And they were trying to do it using Scrum. And I thought, well, that's like a good place to try and maybe introduce some Kanban stuff, because the Scrum stuff wasn't necessarily locking in for them in a lot of ways. It didn't quite have the discipline that Scrum calls for, and a few other things as well. So I thought, well, let's see if we can add some Kanban to the Scrum and see if we can help it get better. And so over the course of about 13 sprints, maybe 14 sprints, we really started to improve a lot of things in how we did our work, from the quality of the work to the lead time of the work. It all started to get better, basically. And we even got to the point where we could actually do some pretty decent, reliable forecasting with things like Monte Carlo. And you're talking about no estimates. That's something we actually started playing with. Was we said, boy, estimates are killing us. And so we tried the forecasting, and we're pretty accurate with it. So overall, over the course of about a year or two, we got this thing running really smoothly. It was a well-integrated team with a lot of decent planning going on in the foreground as well. So that's sort of been my experience since then. I've gone off to help other insurance companies, financial companies, really try and take advantage of some of these concepts with their Scrum teams, or natively with just Kanban by itself. So very open-minded with this as far as how we get Scrum to go better, basically.
Yeah. So let's dive into the topics. I made a few notes that I want to explore a little bit better. And I think that at the start, it makes sense for us to talk about not the history of Scrum and Kanban. I think that would be too long. We would need a whole episode just for that. But rather, what makes them different and why it's been so rare to put them together? Because, in the community, we've seen a very strong Kanban community, a very strong Scrum community, and they kind of hated each other at some point. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think there's a lot more picking up the good ideas where they come from these days. But I remember being in 2006 at a conference where somebody was presenting their initial steps with Kanban, and everybody was going crazy because, you know, you don't have sprints and things like that. So, Joey, let's start with you first. In your perspective and in your experience, what are some of the reasons why Kanban and Scrum have not been used together so much in the past?
I think it's 50-50 in my view, and I'm sure Todd will complement or add to this. But one thing I think is somewhat the way guidance has been given overall. So there has been a lot of larger guidance given by many organizations, many professionals who say, well, you have to choose between these two things. They haven't really looked for complementary overlap, but just looked more for like an operational model that makes sense in the context they're in. So a lot of those financial companies and insurance companies I consulted with, they typically said you have to choose between A or B. They didn't think about coming up with a C version, basically, which is, oh, combine the two together. So there's a little bit of that sort of in the industry of choosing one or the other. And also just the simple fact that Kanban was a foreign agent, so to speak, in the Scrum world. And people said, well, it's not Scrum, it's something else. So there's a little bit of that just simple kind of, we're going to separate these two things apart kind of mindset. And then, of course, the geeks involved in the space all say, well, this is better or that is better. And they argue their way through that sort of performance and measurement analysis thing, which I can understand why they might say that. But in the end, it's more about seeing what fits in the place for the individuals and the teams that we kind of pay attention to these days. So you're right. There's less adversarial feelings today. But to me, that's kind of how I got started, was this sort of like different thing. Now we're going to call it an operating model. Technology starts to be applied that says operating model A or B. And this is kind of how we are where we are today to some degree, right? That's sort of my view on it.
How about you, Todd? What's your experience? What are the key differences between the two, and why haven't we seen more of them used together?
So I think in the early days, there was quite a bit of tribalism. There was the Scrum tribe, there was the Kanban tribe, and tribes behave a certain way. When they're threatened, they feel threatened. And I think in both cases, there was a bit of threat from the other side. So I think that ended up being a huge part of it. Even though I think some of the other elements of this is that they really are quite they're similar in one sense, but they're quite different in terms of their underlying perspective. Scrum, and as a result, I think there's a huge misunderstanding of the approaches, particularly misunderstanding of the Kanban method. Many people think it's just stickies on a wall, or it's something they get out of Jira. It's a board they get out of Jira. But there's a lot more to it, and I think they also frequently look at it. On the flip side, they also look at Kanban through a Scrum lens. So it's like, oh, if Kanban's this other thing, Scrum does things this way, Kanban must also have a similar way of doing this thing. But they're quite different. Scrum is a process framework. It's a framework for product development, meaning that it's incomplete approach to developing products. So it's defining a process framework. Kanban is not a process framework. Kanban is an approach. It's a method for improving your existing process. You start with what you do now, and then based on what you do now, we start applying Kanban practices and principles as appropriate using evolutionary change to bring about improvement. So if you're currently doing Scrum, then that's your process framework. Kanban can be used as an approach for improving that process. And so I think that's the message we're trying to get across now is that these have worked together. We've seen them work together in the wild quite well. And we need to get out of the tribalism mode and into the one where we're realizing the benefits of each. And as Kanban can continue to improve Scrum, there are ways to do that staying within the Scrum framework. It's also possible. We do also see cases where people eventually evolve out of the Scrum framework. That's not our choice. That's up to them to decide. We provide them the tools, and then they do what they want to with them.
So let's dive into what that means in practice. Todd, let's start with you. Can you walk us through a real life case from your organization, some other organization where you implemented Scrum with Kanban, and highlight where you started, and then how Kanban was used to kind of improve what was maybe in the beginning Scrum but that's exactly my guess over time. Can you walk us through one example?
No, exactly. So we have a number of well-documented case studies that we have available on our website where Kanban has been used in conjunction with Scrum, and there's quite a few good results. One that's quite impressive is from Vanguard, a large financial services company. Vanguard had been using Scrum for quite some time in their organization, and they were doing okay, right? They were doing okay-ish, and I don't know how Scrum buddish they were, but they were doing it, and but they weren't getting any better. They were just stalling out. The coach that was there coined it as Scrum stall. That like an airplane stalls out. They had gotten their Scrum, they were doing along, and they weren't improving. They were just doing. So the Kanban was introduced, starting with what they did already, and they also made use of some guidance from the Kanban maturity model, which gives us some pragmatic steps as to how do you take yourself from one level and continuously improve. And they did a couple of different things. They mapped out their complete system, so they did an end-to-end mapping of how their flow was going. They put quite a bit of effort into upstream Kanban. So they added upstream on top of their an upstream perspective.
Open that up a little bit. What do you mean by upstream Kanban?
So upstream meaning how are they selecting work? How are they doing the product discovery, the discovery of items coming in? So not just relying on the magic product owner to know everything, but actually building a workflow, front end of the workflow, to look at how do we decide what to work on and filter that. So, and that exposure, putting that visual exposure and mapping it out and actually putting some structure to that made a huge difference to them to keep their flow moving. A number of other things that they started improving, they implemented WIP limits, work in progress limits to make sure that the system was not overloaded. They focused on flow of the work. The results were really, really impressive. Within 6 months, they had cut their lead times about 75%. So they were taking 1/4 of the amount of time they were. They didn't have outliers, and they also increased the throughput by a factor of 4. So huge improvements from a baseline, all by just applying some basic Kanban practices and principles and continuing to focus and improve.
Yeah. So one aspect that I want to dig further, and maybe Joey can come in and either complement or bring another case study, is of course the numbers are very important, and it's if even the Scrum community talks about cycle time these days. So I guess we could say that's a great victory of the Kanban and the Lean communities that they have been able to bring that terminology to Scrum, which did not have things such as cycle time or throughput when we started way back in the early 2000s. But what are some of the other benefits? We very often in the Scrum community, talk about how the team feels, right? Like, do they feel, not only are they productive, that's a key question, but do they feel happy? Do they feel that they are in an environment that respects them as people? And I want to make sure we also address that, right? Because change affects people in the end, not just the businesses that they are part of. So Joey, what can you bring from that perspective? How have you seen Kanban applied together with Scrum in a way that also highlights the importance of understanding that product development is done by people?
Yeah, I guess to sort of complement what Todd is saying, kind of tying on to the practices piece, and also adding on to what you're asking for, which is sort of that feeling piece of things. When I worked at Department of Labor, one of the first things we did is say, hey, let's visualize our work. They didn't really have it visualized. So we visualized it, which is a very common first step for a lot of Kanban initiatives. But we said, what's planned and what's unplanned? Let's see if we can succeed with our sprints and then accept what is not in the sprint, but it's going to come on our plate. We have to do it in the sprint anyway. So we started doing that, and then using sort of the workflow mapping activities to figure out where's the work hanging out the longest. We just had very simple workflow. We had sort of that, not the upstream that Todd's talking about. We just had basically the backlog, and then we had things like analysis, dev, QA, ready for release, and then released. And we noticed that work was piling up in QA. So we said, how about we do something with that and maybe apply some WIP limits to see if we can get that work to move a little bit smoother. That took a number of sprints, honestly, and iterations, and playing around with WIP limits to find the right mix. It wasn't like a mathematical formula that I set out and said, oh, that's the magic number there, which I think a lot of your listeners probably know. WIP limits aren't necessarily a mathematical formula. It's more of like, how do we apply this so that we get things running smoothly? But with that smooth running behavior, one of the things we did along with the visualization was to have a daily meeting. Now, before it was the classic, I hate to say it, but the classic sort of approach of what are you working on? What are you working on? What are you working on? Any impediments, any issues while we're next to the board. And I said, how about we just look at the board and just see what the board tells us where we need to pay attention. So we started going from right to left, top to bottom, saying, where do we need to pay attention on this board for anything that might need a little extra help? And that extra help question really created more of a collaborative environment among everybody. Because before they were kind of working in silos, pitching work over to the testers, analysts would pitch work over to the developers. It wasn't really a good collaborative, fun feeling environment. And as we started doing this and sort of sharing that awareness of the work and its flow in our environment, I then said, hey, you know what? This is really easy stuff. I would sometimes show up at the daily planning meeting and just say, hey, Patrick, why don't you run this meeting? And some shock would go over his face. He's like, what, me? Like, yeah, you see how easy this is? Tell us what the work is telling us. See if you can figure out where the delay is or where the issues are. And let's see if some people can help out. That was one way that created a little bit more collaboration and fun. But the next thing that really kind of kicked up a notch was me looking at the testers, and they said, guys, you were writing horrible software sometimes. They said, this is just not great. I said, testers, what prevents you from going over to analysts and saying, let's work together? And their heads almost exploded. And they said, we never really thought we could do that. I said, nothing's preventing us here. I'm the manager. We can do this. Why don't we start playing around and seeing how we tag team the work together so we can really get this thing moving faster? My metaphor for this all the time, Vasco, is curling. And one of our trainers out there did a curling video, which is really the idea that you're going to have someone who's going to move that rock down the line. And you're going to have people brushing that pathway, making sure it's as smooth as possible. And they don't care what role they're in. They're just here to make sure that thing runs smoothly. So for me, that creates a lot of good cohesion among the team. Over the course of like 13 sprints, they went from kind of being antagonistic against each other to going out to lunch together. So this was back in the day before COVID, and we all worked in the same site. But I think those practices really do create a better feeling, collaborative kind of teamwork environment for sure.
So there's a couple of things that I got from both of those stories, and they kind of let's say they interweave each other in some of these concepts. For me, one thing that is very important, and we talk about that a lot here on the podcast, is that the daily isn't about what tasks somebody did, and that's a very common anti-pattern that we see in many Scrum implementations. But it's rather, are we progressing towards the sprint goal if we're using Scrum in this specific example, and what might be the obstacles and potentially where are the blockers, the limits to our throughput that prevent us from getting to that sprint goal. And Joey, you mentioned this idea of just looking at the board, right? And that's such a simple technique that can help us understand how the work is flowing and as you said, also detect the bottlenecks. And Todd also talked about focusing on the flow of the work. And this is like the aspect of focusing on the flow of the work can have many ramifications, including that of, you talked about better collaboration. I mean, I remember in the early days of the Kanban Scrum Wars, there was a lot of discussion around this idea of swarming. In fact, there was a whole sub-community in the Kanban community talking about swarming as a way to tackle the bottlenecks and deliver software faster, reduce cycle time, improve the flow of work. And I think that idea can also bring the core aspect of collaboration that, Joey, you were talking about also when you talked about, the testers started talking to the business analysts, right? Like this shift test left, which only makes sense, that whole phrase only makes sense when you look at the process as a flow, right? And you start shifting test left, meaning that you start creating tests earlier in the process, like acceptance tests and so on and so forth. And these are, of course, the great examples and the good examples of what can go right when we are putting Scrum and Kanban together. But for those of you that are now curious and interested and maybe want to get started, let's start with you, Joey. What should they be aware of? What might make this approach difficult and they should be ready for? What are the challenges?
Yeah, so that was 2014 when I figured it out. So 2011 or 2012, I read David's Blue Book and thought, oh, this is awesome. I'm going to do this Monday. I'm going to go back to my office. I'm going to make a whiteboard. I'm going to put my team together on this board. I'm going to have what was called an aggregate personal Kanban board. So I got to see what each person was working on. Now, keep in mind, I was new to this, right? I was excited but new. And my team looks at me on Tuesday after I made the board, and they're like, "Are you okay, Joey? Do you need a taco? Are you all right?" Because they were like, "Dude's gone crazy with tracking stuff." And I was like, "This is how we're going to meet. We're going to try and facilitate conversations by visualizing our work." And that went on for about a year, and they played along really well. They tried to collaborate, but really it was individual reporting. It wasn't really collaborative management of the work going through a workflow. But at the end of that time frame, when I left that organization, they asked me one question. They said, "Can we erase the board?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess you can if you want to." And as soon as as I said yes, before we even had a going away lunch party, they had erased the board and put a smiley face on it. I was like, "Oh, wow, I just learned something here." And in the Kanban method, we call that overreaching, where you simply jump in with too much excitement, you go too far. We have 6 practices in the Kanban method, right? And a lot of people use the first 3. That's the visualization, limiting width, and managing flow. And sometimes even that's a little too fast, a little too furious for the team involved. So that was sort of my lesson learned in terms of an anti-pattern. I didn't do what we now advise people to do, what we educate people to do, which is look at this using an evolutionary change lens and saying, what's the next reasonable thing to do? What has the least resistance? What has the most acceptance to try out? I think if I had gauged things that way, I would have rolled this out a completely different approach and probably had much success with it. But it took that iteration along with a couple other ones that succeeded really well, to then go to the Department of Labor and really have, what people might say is good luck. It was actually good practice of failing and learning along the way that got me there. So overreaching is one of those things I do try to advise people to be aware of, to be mindful of, to say, are you there? Are you actually overreaching? Or is there a smaller step you can take to really get the ball moving in the right direction?
How about you, Todd? What have you learned about blending Scrum and Kanban?
Yeah, I think that Joey hit it on pretty well here. Is the overreaching is a big challenge. And a couple of our principles, our change principles, are to start, as we keep repeating on, start with what you do now, right? So this is not, we're not saying go change everyone's title. Don't reorganize. Just start with what you're doing now, because what you're doing now has a reason. Let's understand what you do now really well, right? And understand what you're actually doing. Because once we understand what you're actually doing, and once we understand where the pain points are, then that gives us an indication of which of those pains are things we want to try to nibble away at, right? And so we only want to take on smaller changes, changes that we're comfortable making, but we also have to have what we call acts of leadership. You've got to step up and actually make change. If you hold a retrospective and don't actually do anything about it, there's no point, right? So you don't have a closed loop until you actually take action. And so what we really believe in is the power of evolutionary change is getting really good at continuously improving, continuously managing, understanding, reflecting, and adapting. As we say, look at where your pains are, have a reflection, and then take the active leadership to close that loop and run these experiments continuously. Get really good at that. You get really good at that, you don't have to make big changes. You just have to make some small changes and get really good at making those small changes continuously. You do that and you have great success. You try to take on too much and you sort of try to push it, and it becomes a huge amount of resistance, and people don't like it. People don't like being changed, but if they're involved in it and they're brought along with it, just a side note looping back to the whole people side of Kanban. Kanban, because of how it focuses on work, people think, oh, it doesn't have the people part. But in fact, it's actually a different approach to it. Many times we say, oh, we have a people problem, we have to bolt fun on, right? And the Kanban approach is, no, we're not going to bolt fun on. What we're going to do is we're going to take dysfunction away. Right? We're going to focus on, once we focus on flow of work, the dysfunctions disappear. And people are really happy. They love it. Right? We have testimonial from people who just tell us how much it's made a difference in their life. And from our survey, 87% of people love Kanban. Say it's better than prior approaches. Most of whom have been coming from Scrum world. So we know that it works, but to do it is take it very slowly, but can get really good at doing it continuously.
So I would be remiss not to bring up the big elephant in the room, which is not Scrum, actually. It's traditional project management. Mm-hmm. Because you guys have mentioned, focus on flow. try to shift some of the activities left, like testing, get people to swarm or collaborate, and getting the tickets all to the end, to the delivery. And in most software organizations, including the ones that use Scrum, they have an overlay of project management on top of Scrum, right? So we could call it Scrum but, or Scrum almost, or Scrum but not really. But in reality, it is this execution, top-down predictive planning mindset that many organizations live with, right? And none of you mentioned this, but I think the idea of understanding work as flowing in a system is revolutionary for people who think in project management terms. In fact, it doesn't even exist. The concept of flow does not exist in the project management body of knowledge. There isn't such a thing, right? In fact, I remember one of the phrases that my Kanban friends used a lot back then is stop starting, start finishing. Right. And right now, the project management, which is still the overarching dominant management metaphor for software delivery, it's not Scrum, it's project management. That approach is the opposite, is stop finishing, start starting even more, right? I was just talking to a friend today morning, and in a small organizations, they have 67 projects ongoing at the moment. They got it down to 47, but only for a few weeks because the other ones came back, right? So how are you guys not talking about this? Like, don't you see any resistance coming from the side of we don't want flow, we just want to predict and plan everything up front?
Well, I think that is a huge challenge, right? Is that the as you say, the switch away from when you have uncertainty, I tend to see that there are two approaches to that. One approach is, I have uncertainty. I need to do more upfront work in order to predict my uncertainty. And there's the other approach, which is really where I think we try to live in the Kanban space, is let's understand that uncertainty really well so that we can manage it once it happens, right? And be prepared for it. And do that by understanding flow and by understanding predictability through historical forecasting, historical data, right? So we see this really distinct difference, and it really goes back to sort of human preference and human, how humans behave. Some are very, very resistant to uncertainty, and they get comfort in doing planning in order to pretend the uncertainty doesn't exist, or they take a different approach to it. So I think that's a shift in general that's going to take a long time. And what we see is the results that we see of the shift towards flow and the shift towards understanding it that way are huge, where traditional project management approaches still continue to fail. The example you gave of pushing things in. When I was an exec, I was needing service requests from our IT department. Okay, and so we would send requests into the IT department, and the project manager's job, they felt their job was to start the project. They said, "Oh yeah, no worry, it's in the system," right? Well, the system had over 100 items in it, and the lead times were in year, measured in more than 1 year. And so, fortunately, that group decided they needed to change, right? And so they started taking on Kanban. And so I was a customer then of that implementation. And so I was on the business side of the request, and there were 3 VPs. And so each of us we said, we're going to have no more than 10 items in the queue at any time. Right? So we would say, when a new slot comes up, whoever's turn it is gets to put one in. And it was a huge difference. We started getting items out in less than a month, things that were taking a year. And not only that, but we discovered a whole lot of things had aged. They didn't need to happen anymore. And so we would just filter them out, and we were getting the things out that actually mattered. And so it was a huge difference. And when you start things without getting them finished, you have this, it's much more like milk than wine. It ages very poorly.
Exactly, exactly. How about you, Joey? What has been your uh, maybe I would call it experience, but maybe just observations with trying to bring the flow mindset into a start-stop, i.e., project management organization?
Yeah, I can give you two examples from what I've experienced in the field. And early on in my work with Kanban, I was told, and this is before Kanban was something I brought up to my management, but my management told me, we're in a political environment here. You need to say yes to every project that's asked of you. And I was like, oh, so I'm just inventorying all the requests, basically. And they're like, yeah, when you can start them, start them. And so there was this constant juggling of who got what in terms of stuff delivered to them. And later on, I'd say about a couple of years later, after my work with Department of Labor, actually, I did what was called an accredited Kanban consultant credential with Kanban University. And you have to provide your evidence there to say, what did you do? What did you learn? Good stuff, bad stuff, whatever. And I brought up this example saying, look at the actual cumulative flow diagram on this. And I put together the cumulative flow diagram, which showed us like how much had actually been done versus how much had been committed to. And I called it the blue whale because at the very top of this diagram was this big blue blob of all the yeses I had said. And there was this very, very thin sliced line, like almost as thin a slice as cheese as you can get, almost transparent, of stuff we got done. And so it was more about a job of juggling demand than it was really delivering value. So that was just my experience early on. But once I got to Department of Labor, something really interesting happened there. And it wasn't until maybe Sprint 8 or Sprint 9 that this happened. And by Sprint 8 or Sprint 9, we actually got to be somewhat predictable and reliable with our flow. And my manager could care less, honestly. He was like, great, you guys are predictable. You know, stuff's actually getting done. That's what mattered to him. But it really clicked with him around Sprint 8 or Sprint 9 when we had a last minute emergency meeting. We had to clear our deck for all of our committed work. This new priority project came through. And he said, guys, we'll clear our deck for our work and we're going to get everything done in 30 days. Well, guess what? I had been tracking all this data all along about our performance. And I said, well, what does that look like? What happens if we forecast this compared to your very confident, very heroic commitment level of saying we're going to do this in a month? And he's telling the stakeholders it'll be a month long. Well, I'd sit there in the same meeting with my Monte Carlo forecast and I say, wait a minute, I'm seeing 92 days on this. And I said, Mike, look, you may not want to commit like this. You may want to hold back and just commit a little bit more broadly. A quarter would be safe. And he said, actually, no, we're going to go for it. And so I kept that to myself. And for the next 93 days, actually, we built the solution and delivered it to the customer. And then I came back and we said, okay, we're done with that. And I said, by the way, look at the timeline for how long it took us to get that done. And here's my forecasted timeline 90 something days ago. I'm off by about 3 days back when we were in that meeting. And he goes, oh. And suddenly the light bulb goes off. Well, dang, maybe this is more reliable than the typical kind of control and force and push kind of model. And so that opened him up to think more creatively about planning that way. So sort of like what we're talking about here with what Todd's been mentioning is that in some ways we have to introduce this new concept, this new way of working with the reality of what they see. So kind of getting to the reality of how you truly perform, not sort of artificially forecasting or forcing that kind of performance out of groups of individuals. Because if, like Todd is saying, if you give them the ability to be more autonomous and really improve their flow, they're going to beat your forecasts in the end. They're actually going to be even better at continuously improving the flow of work. So for the Department of Labor, we went from like 95 days of lead time down to about 11 in 13 sprints. So it's possible to get this benefit out of it. But I think, like Todd may be saying, is the knock-on effect with the upper management, with the portfolio program people, they will eventually become aware of it and start to think through it and probably want to see more about it. It doesn't mean they're going to change their ways immediately. I hate to say that. They're the PMO tribe, right?
Absolutely. Let's not forget that even though we are talking about Scrum and Kanban being separate tribes at some point, I don't think that applies so much anymore. Let's not forget that there's a much larger tribe. In fact, the 99% tribe, which is the project management tribe. And of course, many of it is just even implicit, right? People don't even think about it, but they say, oh, we have to sequence the work. Okay, that's a project management concept. We don't sequence the work in Kanban or Scrum. We prioritize the work and we flow work to completion, which is a totally different perspective. And the sequencing, upfront predictive sequencing that Gantt charts bring into the work that we do, and we see that at portfolio level, is destroying our ability to be predictable because, of course, obviously, when your plans have no margin, a small error can completely derail the whole plan. Okay, rant over. We have one last question. I'll start with Todd. Todd, if you this is an exercise in futurism. Caveat emptor, as they say. What do you think Agile looks like when we push the current best practices even further? Like you guys are talking about Kanban, of course, but Kanban builds on a lot of practices that come from many other places, like visualizing work and flow and the economic understanding of the flow of work. Great work by Reinertsen as well. So there's a lot of good ideas that come there, right? And Kanban or Scrum, whatever that is, the good ideas that are out there, if we push them all the way up to 11, what happens then? What does Agile look like when we push all the great practices all the way up to 11?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I'd love to have people just even close to 10, because usually what we see out there is closer to 2 in terms of what they're actually doing in practice. But no, I think there's a lot of great things that we've learned in 20 plus years of agility. And I think that there's a lot of great practices, and some of the really foundational things that come from different approaches. Extreme programming still has a lot of great things that very few people are doing. I think that there's a lot of other things. I think the part that I think is probably, I'll twist the thing around a little bit, and where's the one where the biggest gains I think will come in terms of what we can do. And I think it's going to be where I've always discovered the biggest challenge is rarely in the solutioning, it's in the discovering of what the problem is in the first place. Right? So I think that's really where we could get a lot better. And if we can get better, to the extent we can get better in that space, it allows everything downstream to flow smoothly. So the challenge that I usually see is that people are developing the wrong things, or they don't know how to discover what they're doing. So if I would have a magic wand and say which practice I'd love to see at 11, or at least get way beyond where it is today, it would be in product discovery. How do we get better at understanding, really fundamentally understanding customer needs? Not what they say they want, but what they actually need, right? What are the problems they're encountering? And I think that's an art that is it's still in its infancy, but it's one of by far the most important, I think. Because when I've seen that behavior where we've had that, everything goes smoothly, right? It actually doesn't really matter. Everything else just happens. But when we don't have that, it creates all sorts of challenges, bickering, people not knowing what to do, clarity isn't there. And so it's really frustrating for people. But when you've got that flow from the beginning, you get flow all the way through, and people have a pride in what they do and why they're doing it, and it all comes together. So it really, I was fortunate, during that time, I say during the 1990s, where I was struggling with trying to understand it. The environment I had, we had that, right? We knew what we were doing, we knew why we were doing it, and it was just an incredibly fun place to be, where everyone was energized, and people wanted to be there. So.
Yeah, definitely. I know what you mean, and I've seen it happen. How about you, Joey? What do you see when you imagine people and companies, organizations putting all the Agile practices up to 11?
Well, to be fair about 11, the only group that I know has been able to get to 11 is Spinal Tap, the movie. So just saying, Vasco, since you referenced 11, I just want to make sure that everyone understands 11 is really going to be hard to get unless you're Spinal Tap. So, but like Todd's saying, if you go down a couple of notches, and honestly, if we get to 5, you guys are crushing it. So you're on your way to becoming Spinal Tap, basically. But the thing that I think of, it sort of complements what Todd's saying. He's really great at saying, look, that discovery piece is something that really is low-hanging, easy to grab fruit that really could provide a lot of value for you. In terms of our practices, we actually have 6 practices in the Kanban method. I'm saying that again because I see so many companies that use the first 3 and they forget the last 3. So the first 3 are like, visualizing the work, limiting the work in progress, managing the flow. That's all good stuff right there at the Scrum team level. Really easy wins. The other stuff's really fun too, which is making policies explicit and improving collaboratively and evolving experimentally. That's the one that really sticks out to me there. So when I think about improving collaboratively, evolving experimentally, that to me is where you can start to really say, how do we adapt in our environment thoughtfully? And that goes back to Todd's argument of like, well, what's the right problem to solve right now? Not the solution, right? We have tons of practice in the Kanban method, like you're saying. You can easily grab one of those things and start to slap it together and say, does that work? But the behavior, the treatment of learning, I think is super important these days. I think if we can learn more confidently, more openly, more flexibly, and discover along the way and pivot as we need to, you're in a much better place than you were before. You're adaptive effectively. And I think that's what we're bringing to the table more and more as we learn and develop new products here at Kanban University, is that idea of, well, how can we help people leverage that awareness individually, but also at the team level or at the organizational level? Because I think that's what people are really after, is how do we do this more effectively and do feedback loops a little bit faster? And how do we learn from that and gain better results in the end? So that's kind of how I look at it, from getting from 0 to 11. Remember, 11, you can't reach. Spinal Tap only owns that. So right there.
Remember, 11 is a metaphor for always improving, right? It's that North Star, which also comes from the Kanban community. I do remember a lot of Kanban people developing the Kanban ideas, talking about the strategic impact, and North Star as being one of the things, or one of the approaches to defining strategy. Okay, but we're getting close to the end. I want to thank you for being here, bringing your thoughts, your lessons learned, and of course also your ideas for the future to this discussion. Todd, let's start with you. If people want to know more about you and the work that you're doing, where should they go?
Certainly can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's a great opportunity, and if you want to have a conversation, that'd be great. Our website, Kanban University, is a great place to get started with materials. We have resources out there, the Kanban Guide, and we have a number of blog posts on Scrum with Kanban, Scrumming Better with Kanban. So, but yeah, happy to connect with people and find me.
Absolutely. So everybody, do check out the links on the show notes to find Todd. And how about you, Joey?
Same here. LinkedIn is the best place to reach me, and I'm usually there every day, a couple of times a day. But also, like Todd said, if you go to kanban.university, which is our website, you'll find the blog posts, you'll see courses out there, and much more. And we try to share as much as we can, like with great people like you, Vasco, at other conferences as well. So you'll probably find one of us or one of our colleagues out there, an accredited Kanban trainer or accredited Kanban consultant, speaking on a little bit more about what Kanban is and how to use it effectively in your organization.
That's it. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you, Vasco.
Thank you, Vasco.
Hi there, Agile friends. Thank you for sticking around and listening to the details of the Product Owner Summit, this year's global summit dedicated to a critical Scrum role, the Product Owner role, of course. We'll have some amazing keynotes and 4 tracks filled with first-hand stories and experiences for product owners to learn more about that critical Scrum role. The summit will take place between April 23rd and 25th, so book your calendars. There will be loads of sessions for you to attend. One of the keynotes will be Dave West, the product owner and CEO at Scrum.org, one of the largest Scrum organizations in the world. If you want to know more, check out the details at bit.ly/product owner 2024. That's all one word, all lowercase, bit.ly/product owner 2024. We will also have 4 tracks. The 4 tracks will cover cross-functional product ownership. That's track 1. As Pixar's Ratatouille said, not every idea can be a great idea, but a great idea can come from anywhere. And this quote emphasizes the importance of a product owner being open to all ideas, regardless of the source, and also challenges us to focus on getting good ideas from everywhere and involving the whole team in the product owner role and responsibilities. The second track is Designing Products for Growth, where we explore how to craft products ready for scalable growth, merging practical strategies with innovation. The idea here is to learn to design products for growth, whether it is sales or customer acquisition. The third track is Know Your Users, user-centric approaches for Agile development. In this track, we learn to master user-centric techniques in Agile development, to deeply understand customer needs and transform insights into meaningful UX designs that focus on engagement and satisfaction. This is a track ideal for innovation-focused Agile teams. And the fourth track, one of the most exciting tracks in my opinion, is product development with AI, ideas for product owners. Not only do we discuss about using AI in the products, but also AI for product owners to learn to make a bigger impact with the help of the AI tools that we already have. The Product Owner Summit will also present to you great opportunities to network with your peers. So get your ticket and join our Slack. You can get the ticket and join the Slack at bit.ly/Product Owner 2024. As always, we have free tickets and also the paid tickets that help to support this podcast. So check them out at bit.ly/Product Owner 2024. That's all lowercase, all one word, Product Owner 2024. I'll see you in the summit floor.